Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and I am back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have the Republican-led Texas House just passed a bill making it illegal to share altered political memes, images, and videos without a disclaimer. The penalty would be up to 1 year in jail or a $4,000 fine, and that was posted by Swan Panky Dan, and it's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think that goes against freedom of speech. I do hear the caveat that it's only for PAC candidates and others that run political ads, but even then, I still think that would go against freedom of speech. And, a lot of Republicans love to say, oh, I'm for freedom of speech, but, they, like a lot of progressives, will make exemptions for that if they feel like they can justify it. So, yeah, I personally don't really care for any censorship, but ultimately, if the state wants to enforce any censorship in terms of fines or jail time, it has the monopoly on the legal use of force to do so if it wants. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, as I said, but that's just how it is sometimes. Then we have Pam Bondi. President, your first 100 days has far exceeded that of any other presidency in this country. Ever, never seen anything like it. Thank you. And that was a post from Swan Panky Dan, and that's a cross post from the Scoop subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think she's riding Trump's dick a little too hard there. I do think his first 100 days were slightly better than I would expected them to be. But still, just because he's doing the bare minimum doesn't mean he should be praised. If you want to praise him and think he's the greatest president ever, that's fine. But personally, I think he's just doing the bare minimum, if that. So I personally wouldn't praise him that much. But if you want to praise him, that's fine. If it's like MAGA. If you're a MAGA, you need to think he's the greatest president ever. I think he's Jesus. But if you're Trump, if you're woke, you need to think he's like Hitler and the worst president ever. That's why I really don't care about Trump and the whole orange man good, orange man bad circle jerk. It's just social media. In the days of social media, you can't have nuance anymore. You either think he's the greatest ever or the worst ever, and yeah, it just tires me out after a while. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have From Deportation Dungeons to Indoctrination Classrooms, The Architecture of American Authoritarianism from LuciusJanis.substack.com. And that was posted by Oside Brett. And yeah, I personally don't think we should have deportation dungeons or indoctrination classrooms, but as I've said, the state can justify doing whatever it wants to. And yeah, if you want to, and personally, I think this is kind of, Reddit kind of always seems to, always play up American authoritarianism when the red party's in power, but they'll always downplay it when the blue party's in power. And that's another thing I always say, people don't have values these days, they have teams. I'm sure if it was the deportation dungeons for the MAGA people and indoctrination classrooms for their children, so they indoctrinate them to the woke LGBTQ plus stuff, Reddit would say this was the greatest thing ever, but since the out-group's doing it rather than the in-group, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have RFK Jr. rejects cornerstone of health science, germ theory, from ArsTechnica.com, posted by LegioX, and that's a cross post from the Not the Onion subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think germ theory is a cornerstone of modern science, but if RFK Jr. wants to reject that, I think he should be able to, and yeah, I think the libertarian solution is, every cabinet department, not just HHS, is a field that the government shouldn't be involved in. The government shouldn't be involved in labor. The government shouldn't be involved in education. I see no reason why the government should be involved in health in the first place. So personally, I think if you want to think RFK Jr. is the worst thing ever, that's fine. But you just want your person in there instead to control the government, health, and human services. You don't want health freedom, and that's, I think, the libertarian position. Libertarian is for health freedom, and I think the libertarian way of accomplishing that would be getting the government out of health entirely. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have How Republicans Sell Censorship, Do It for the Woman and Children from Reason.com, posted by Spare Simeon. And yeah, I would agree with that. I personally don't care for a lot of Republican censorship. Like one thing that a lot of people seem to be talking about in the comment section of this one is pornography. And yeah, I personally don't really care for pornography, and I think it's really corrupted our society. But if people want to do it, I don't think the state should be telling them they can't do it. Porn, it's practically a religion on Reddit, but they have every right to make it their religion if they so choose to. And yeah, I don't care how young kids are exposed to porn these days. Their parents should be watching over them rather than the state. And just because something's well intentioned, like a porn ban, is not an excuse for state censorship. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Chris Krebs, ex-head of cybersecurity agency targeted by Trump, has global entry membership revoked from CBSNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, I personally don't really care for Chris Krebs, but if they want to revoke his membership, they should be able to. Ultimately, it comes down to who is in what positions to justify what, and yeah, people will justify what they justify regardless of the system of governance in place. I would say, I think, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have AFD classified right-wing extremist from tagshaw.de, posted by Swan Pinky Dan, and that's cross-post from the Europe subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be classifying political parties as anything. Because the next thing you know, you get around to banning political parties. And, a lot of people say the AFD is the new Nazi party. Well, in reality, I would say they're the Communist Party from the German pre-Nazi period. They might have different ideologies. The Communist Party was more left-wing back then. The AFD is more right-wing. But, the Communists were the first ones they banned. And I think the AFD might end up being the first ones banned in this new era. And yeah, just because you don't like a political party doesn't mean you should be classifying them as an extremist organization or banning them. But, the state, they'll justify saying whatever they want to, I guess, since they have the monopoly on the legal use of force. So yeah, I personally, if you want to consider AFD right-wing extremists, I think that's a reasonable position, but I don't think the state should be the one classifying that. The state shouldn't be telling us what groups are extremists and what groups aren't. The Southern Poverty Law Center does that, and I shit on them a lot, but at the very least, I think they're private rather than a public enterprise, and that's what I think the Libertarian position is. If you want to have a group that says, oh, the XX group is anti-government or extremist, you should be able to, but I think it should be public private rather than public, and you should be able to discredit them as if you feel like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Donald Trump calls for Democrats to be removed over impeachment moves from Newsweek.com, hosted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a crosspost from the No Shit Sherlock subreddit. And yeah, I don't really care for Donald Trump, but the Democrats are calling to remove him. He should be able to call for their removal as well if he feels like. So, it's interesting, when the Democrats call for Trump's removal, it's justified, but when he calls for their removal, it's the worst thing ever. And that just goes to show you how, people don't have values, they have teams. And yeah, if he wants, I think Trump, I think they should just, cool it for all the impeachment stuff, since, he's already been impeached twice, and, just impeaching him again would just probably be a virtue signal since they don't have the numbers in the Senate currently. But, if they want to talk about impeachment, I think they should be able to. And I definitely do think if Trump wants to come after them for doing that, they should be able to as well. But as long as, everyone can express themselves. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Malay severely damaging press freedom in Argentina, says Watchdog, from batimes.com.r, posted by Knee Concussions. And yeah, this is just another article. I don't think Malay is perfect, but this is just another example of how whenever you go against the globalist agenda, they're going to smear you. I don't think he's really cracking down on press freedom as much as someone like, Vladimir Putin is in Russia. But, if it's the people who want him, who hate libertarianism and want him out. They'll smear him with whatever they can get. I personally think, if he wants to justify using the force of the state to crack down on press freedom, that's on him. But just because the press is free doesn't mean that I think as I've said in the past, the libertarian position is we should have a free press, but an accountable press. And it's like when Donald Trump sues CBS or ABC, NBC, or any of the alphabet legacy media news sources. I personally don't think that's libertarian because they should have a right to say whatever they want to. But I think they're inherently unaccountable because they can say whatever lies they want to, and no one will hold them accountable for it a lot of the time. But especially before social media. But yeah, I think the libertarian position is let the lying mainstream media fail on its own merits rather than justify using the force of the state to go after them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.